This is Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur with your host, Lynn Friest. Lynn will share ideas and expert advice from people that are walking in your shoes and living their encore careers, where they want and at the pace they want. You'll start a company of one with confidence and knowledge to live a fulfilled life of freedom and ease. Lynn is a coach and leadership consultant whose mission is to show senior leaders and experts how to start something refreshing and new after a full career in the corporate environment.
Well, hello. Welcome to this episode of Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur. Thanks for listening. You can be creating value in the world beyond just winning that next pickleball game. You can work when you want, where you want, and you can do the work you love. So if you're ready to get started today, please contact me at lynnfriest.com. And again, thanks for listening. This is episode 193, and it's about peak performance with Brian Gillette. Brian leads the Summiting Group, which helps people reach their peak performance. Brian has over 25 years experience in leadership and organizational development with both small and large companies. And to add to that, he's an ultramarathoner. He's run over 205 miles around Lake Tahoe. So he's stood on the summits of many mountains and completed many physically and mentally challenging ultra-distance events. So looking forward to our conversation. Some of the things we'll talk about today are Brian's got a book, and he'll talk about his book and how he did 100 interviews. We'll talk about why you need a big why in life to really keep things going, the need to have priorities, and the ability to say no so that you can focus on those priorities. He'll share his framework for being deliberate about achieving big things. And finally, we'll talk about how the right mindset can help you achieve things you once thought were impossible. And with that, we'll talk with Brian. Welcome, Brian. It's great to have you on the show. And I'd like to lead off by just asking you what's something interesting you're doing and what's new in life for you right now?
Hey, Lynn, it is great to be on your show. I appreciate you having me on. I'm just happy to be out traveling. These last couple of years were a little bit rough, and we had a number of trips planned, and I love to travel. I love adventure, and we had to slow that down into 2020, 2021. And so starting to get back on the road. So in about a week and a half, I'm heading to Italy, and then just signed up to head down to Antarctica for the end of the year. So that's the big thing going on. There's other work related stuff, but that's far more enjoyable.
It's a person who's a ultramarathoner, and I'm sure you were at least a little stifled in the last couple of years in what you wanted to do.
I love adventure. So to me, it was a challenge. I have two boys. Right now, they're 14 and 16. So that when they were a couple of years younger, when we went into COVID, a couple of years prior to that, my wife and I took them out of school for a year and we traveled around the world. Mm-hmm. And so we spent a year together in very small spaces. And so when COVID hit, it's like, okay, we've done this. We know how to we know how to live together in these small spaces. Granted, it wasn't easy, it wasn't ideal, but I always looked at it as, okay, how can I make the best of this throughout it? And I tend to be very positive. I tend to be very optimistic. Throughout it, I kept saying, we have this opportunity where we either have to work from home, we have our kids at home, we're all together. How do we take advantage of this opportunity where everybody else is going, oh, it stinks, it stinks, it stinks. And it did stink a lot. There's never going to be that opportunity where we're like this. And so what can we do to try to turn this cloudy day into something a little bit more positive? And so my mind was always looking for ways to try to make things fun, to make things a little bit different, to try to see that silver lining.
Sure, absolutely. A friend of mine that she lives in Canada and she's a runner, but she had a 200-foot driveway. She did virtual runs up and down her driveway during that period before she could really get back into actual races. So yeah. I appreciate the ingenuity of it.
You do. You have to look at things a little differently. I found my wife and I started going for walks every night after dinner. Mm-hmm. And because it's a chance to get outside and we could spend time together and just get away from all the craziness inside the house. Mm-hmm. And we still do that. We go out and we go for about a half hour and just kind of say what was happening through the day. So
sure. That's great. And you've got an interesting resume, interesting things you've been doing and you're working on now. Could you give us an overview of it?
Yeah, so my background is right now I run my own consulting practice. I do leadership development. I really focus on two aspects. One is I do individual executive coaching. So somebody's in a corporate environment and they're trying to expand their leadership skills, look to go to the next level. I do one-on-one work with them around their leadership skills, do some assessments and help them. And then the other one is around team facilitation. So you've got a group and you're pulling everybody together and you want to figure out how do we optimize the team a little bit more? How do we get aligned around our strategy? And so I will work with the group and help them get aligned around the strategy. Just make sure everybody's working on the same page because so often I get phone calls. It's we're all on different pages. It's okay. Let's try to get you in the same book. And so that's a lot of what I focus on. I just put a book out, which is based on a bunch of interviews from about 100 executives and ultra distance or endurance athletes. And I've been both. Just on how do you push yourself to the further? We often have put this limit in our head and think, oh, that's as far as we can go. But I think we can go a little bit further. And so I wanted to learn from a bunch of people of what they do. And so that's been doing those interviews was fascinating. And it's been a fun adventure.
So take off on your book where you talk to 100 executives. Given my audience, any thoughts those executives had about that next stage in life? I know they were trying to perform in their current spot. Any of them thinking about what they were going to do next?
You know, what's amazing about them is they were all thinking about what was next. And they were very deliberate of how they used their time. They were deliberate of where they were going. And so I just got the impression, and many told me this, that they're always thinking about what that next step is. And there is a certain amount of just not being content where you are, which I think a certain amount of that can be healthy. But what they were they were deliberate and they knew where they wanted to go and focused on how to get there. And so it just, that was a skill or that was a behavior that I saw come out tremendously with the people, that deliberate and that focused on, all right, this is where I want to go next. And here's what I need to do in order to get there.
Yeah, that's interesting because often I think in whatever job we have, you focus on the current activities. How can I be great at what I currently do? But then thinking about that next step is something we don't always do, I don't think.
We don't. And when I'm talking to people from a career counseling perspective and it's something I've always done, is always be thinking about what your next job is. You got to think about what you're doing now because you got to be successful in it and you got to focus on it. But you should also be thinking about what's that next step I want to do or the next couple of steps I want to do, because that should be driving what you're doing now. I was talking to a group the other day and I was saying, think about what you want your life to be like when you're 80 or 90. And then let's back into how you got there. So I'm a big proponent of think about that next step and don't wait to go into that next job when you are completely ready. Go in before you're fully ready because that's where you're gonna grow.
Yeah, I know I had a friend once that said, here's your comfort zone, but over there is where the magic happens. You got to be willing to go over there.
Yeah. It's funny because the keynote I was just doing for a group, it's getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And you got to build, that is a muscle that you have to build up and know. I use the analogy of swimming, and we don't start off in the deep end of the pool. We start off in the shallow end of the pool and we move our way into the deep end of the pool, and it gets to be a little uncomfortable, but that's when we start to grow. So I love that thought.
Yeah. And I think of the people that, I'm working with on an Encore career, and there's a big disruption that happens when they leave the corporate life to do whatever they want to do, because all the structure you had around the people you knew, whatever it may have been, there was, as I say, quote, now you're retired or you're moving on. You can do anything you want is the good news and the bad news, because all of a sudden I don't have those routines and stuff that used to keep me going through my day.
What are some of the big challenges you hear from people, Lynn?
Sometimes it's interesting, as you mentioned, the high achievers, is because all of a sudden they start thinking a little less about success and maybe a little more about significance.
Yeah.
So it's not just, am I going to make another $100 million for my company, but it's all of a sudden, is there something else that's just as important? And I think COVID gave everybody a little bit of a reassessment on some of these questions. But the other piece is that, again, for corporate people stepping away, and especially if they want to start their own business, you used to have people who did marketing for you. You used to have people who did accounting for you. All of a sudden, you can still get people to do it for you, but you have to think about these things now. So it's all of a sudden you're a company of one versus I'm one person in a corporation.
I feel that pain. And so I know what you're talking about because I experienced something very similar. I was managing a decent sized group. I was in a corporate world. And so in my mid 40s, I went out on my own and I had the opportunity to semi-retire and focus on some things that I really enjoy. And it allowed me, one of the reasons I did it is my father-in-law was on the verge of passing away, and he did shortly after. And I thought, my kids are young. They were probably 4 and 6, 3 and 5 at the time. And I remember thinking, I don't want to miss seeing them grow up. And my parents, who now are in their mid 80s, I didn't want to miss kind of time with them. Mm-hmm. And so it allowed me to refocus. Yeah, I could stay in the corporate world and earn a lot more money, but that money's not going to be nearly as important as the relationship I'm going to have with my kids or my wife or my parents. But that first year was a bit challenging for me. I was doing some part-time consulting, really doing some projects I love to do. But I was helping out in the school. I was helping out in my kids' classroom where I'd walk them to class. And there was that challenge of my worth as a male was it's go to work, bring the money home. And it was the career. It was that. And often as I was walked to school, I would think, I wonder what all these people think of me. Am I some loser that can't keep a job or doesn't have a job? And it took me about a year to get comfortable in my skin. But to your point, it's about looking at what's more significant.
Yeah. And the other piece I believe is too, I always encourage people to consider themselves a master and an apprentice. So whatever your skills and knowledge, you're a master. Maybe nobody cares that you were a manager of logistics, but they care about the fact you really know logistics. On the other hand, being on your own, running a company of one, you got to be an apprentice at that. And often you got to learn some new technology skills. But more importantly, it's kind of like the other big thing is, you're no longer a title, but you have to explain how you can provide value to people because they don't care what your title was. And so you have to spend some time thinking about, okay, how do I add value? You do, and you need to be confident in that, but it's a question that you have to work through.
Yeah, it took a little while to do that. I saw my dad retired when he was 50, and he completely stopped working and didn't go and do consulting like I'm doing. But this was back in the early 90s, late 80s. And when he did that, and he talked about some of the challenges. He goes, I wish there was a book out that talked about, because that's young for somebody in his generation. It's young for anybody. But he goes, I wish there was a book out that helped me figure out how to retire at the early age. And now I'm sure there's all sorts of books out. And you talk about this stuff.
Yeah. And the other thing that I've found is that often our picture of, quote, retirement comes from looking at our grandparents or our parents or whatever it may be, when in fact, our retirement is probably going to look different because one, we're living longer and healthier longer. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, if you're looking at the next 20 years, is pickleball kind of what you're going to focus on or what, So, and on the other hand, though, getting into your other arena with fitness and things like that, we may have to scale our fitness, but on the other hand, we still have to pay attention to that. And I think you probably found that to be true.
I do. I've done some ultra marathons. I mean, one of the kind of the biggest one I've done is, and I did it when I was 47, is ran 205 miles around Lake Tahoe. Is just this iconic lake that spans California and Nevada, and crosses the border. And all at elevation. At one point, we're almost at 10,000 feet, but most of the time we're between 6,000 and 8,000 feet. And it's not easy to do something like that. And a lot of people, even when I talk about marathons or doing shorter events, people often say, oh, I'm too old for that. And it's an excuse I think we use a lot. And I talk in one of the keynotes I do, I talk about the excuses we put in our head. And I'm too old, I can't do this, whatever it is. And so I had done some research to find out what's the oldest person to have run a marathon. And he's 100 years old. So I was talking to this group the other day and I said, he's 100 years old. And I said, I can look around and I don't think there's anybody in this room that's 100. And he ran his first marathon when he was 89.
Mm-hmm.
So we put these excuses in our head and it's like, all right, maybe you're not too old.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that health is an important thing. It's how are we making sure that our body's strong, which keeps our mind strong? I think that's a critical thing. I'm sure this podcast keeps you young.
Yeah, it does. And because I keep meeting interesting people. And I think that just helps me keep my mind working and all that. So it's good for me as well as for hopefully my audience. But I think of that whole idea of having something to work towards, whatever it may be. And I all the time use this. My mother's 96, but she had a good friend who was in her late 90s. And that friend said every year she had a project. And so in the year she passed at 98, her project she was working on that year was to learn Italian. So I think we can always keep those things in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, it's that purpose that keeps you alive. And I know I'm the same thing with kind of exercise goals. It's what is my big exercise goal that I want to do this year? And so as we were coming up to the end of last year, I was thinking about that. It's like, I need a goal. And I look at my wife, I need some goal. And she looks at me like, oh, no. And I thought, all right, I'm gonna turn 55 this year, and I want to do one sit-up per day for every year old I am. And so, like I just turned 55 the other day, and so for the first 3 months, I did 54 sit-ups, and now I figured I'll do 55, and that's 20,001 sit-ups for the year. And so I started doing. I figured I'm going to do 60 every day because then I've got money in the bank. For some reason, I'm sick. And then after the first month, 60 became, okay, I can do that. So now I'm up to 90 a day. And then, as I'd mentioned, I love to travel. We're heading down to Antarctica at the end of the year. And the ship that we're on, it's a relatively small, it's a 170 passenger ship. They have a track, which is 1/12 of a mile. And so I threw out, one of my sons runs cross country in high school. And I threw out the idea. I said, hey, what do you think about running a marathon on the ship when we're in Antarctica? And he looks at me, he goes, I'm in. And then my other son, who's not yet a runner, he goes, I'll do it. So it's that goal. It gives me something to look forward to. It gives me kind of purpose. So I agree with you, Lynn. That purpose is really important. And then what's that broader purpose in life that we have?
Sure. Yeah, and you have some very dramatic goals. This woman I mentioned earlier that in Canada, she also runs extended distance races, but her focus is helping people, what she calls the back of the pack. Mm-hmm. She views herself as a Clydesdale runner. But I'm always intrigued because she says, okay, there's a whole lot of people that are never going to be on the podium. She says, I'm going to help those people have the best experience that they can. And so,
I applaud that. Most people won't be on the podium. You only get there's only 3 spots. So
right. But,
I applaud that.
But that's similar. I think that whole idea of we have goals, we're going to try to achieve whatever those goals may be. And I think that's a great thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned too your book. Any other thoughts that come to mind of these 100 executives, the overall themes that come out of your book?
Yeah. One of the other ones that came out is they're very clear on kind of their why and what it goes back to purpose that we were talking about. Of the 100 people that I talked to, 75 of them were at a C level, kind of CIOs, CHROs, CFOs, CEOs, founded their own company, were the president of a company, something along those lines. And then the other 25% were ultra distance. Some people spanned both. A number of people spanned both. So like one guy I talked to in his 60s, he cycled from Cairo, Egypt down to Cape Town, 12,000 miles. Wow. I talked to 2 people who did 7 marathons, 7 days on 7 continents. But a number of people who founded their own company and started with nothing and grew it up. And so when I'd ask them, what keeps you going when, it's really hard? And they say, we're very clear on why we're doing this and what we're going to feel when we stand on that mountain peak or kind of reach our destination. And one guy I was talking to, He runs a very large economic development area for the capital of California and all of the cities in California, in the area in California near the capital. And I said, "What keeps you going?" And he says, "When I was a kid, I saw my dad lose his job because the economy started to go down.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw what that did to him, and he just lost that will. I never want that to happen to the people around me or to my kids or to feel that way. And so that's why I work so hard to build up this region." And so it was very clear on his why. Another guy I spoke to runs a fairly large engineering function. So he's running that during the day. And then on the weekends, he was training to be an Ironman.
Mm-hmm.
And an Ironman is a fairly grueling event. And so I said, "How do you manage both of those things? How do you get up at 3, 4 in the morning when you just would much rather stay in bed?" He said, "Well, I think of my uncle who died on the couch." And I said, "Tell me more." He goes, "When my uncle kind of hurt his back, and that made he spent a lot more time on the couch. And because he was on the couch, he was starting to get heavy, and he was getting heavy. So he couldn't work out, and they wouldn't get him off the couch. And it was just this downward spiral. And I just saw him die on the couch.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want that to be me." He goes, "So when I don't want to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning and go for a run or a swim or a bike ride," he goes, "I think of that." And so it's really understanding, why are we doing what we're doing, which is going to help us move forward. There's so many stories like that of people, the executives that I interview, that just, you got to be clear on why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, there's a book by Harvard professor Becca Levy, who says from her studies, you can actually add 7.5 years to your life if you've got a positive purpose in your life.
Yeah.
She says and that's actually better than some other health things you can do, but you need to add those also. But that whole idea of, if you've got something in front of you or a big why, makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah. I mean, that positive view, that big why. You even look at, there's been some studies on people who tend to have optimistic behavior than pessimistic behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And if they go in for some surgery, the optimists come out and recover quicker.
Mm-hmm.
And don't have to go back into the hospital than the pessimist. So even the kind of our mind plays on our physical capabilities. So I'll have to look for that book and learn more.
Yeah, I think it's called The Age Code. But anyway, and I'll send you a link to it. The other thought occurs with your work with the marathoning and ultra running, the necessary pieces of not just performance, but recovery. I think sometimes in the corporate world, some of us have spent all our time performing and never spent any time recovering. And yet you probably know a whole lot about that.
You do. You have to know how to recover both mentally and physically. And it's funny, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they're working full time. They're trying to start a business, and then they've got a family. And he was trying, it's like, I'm looking for some work-life balance. And part of what I told him is, you're not going to have work-life balance. And a lot of the people I talk to don't have a work-life balance. And I think too often we think about work-life balance as on a short-term basis, maybe over a week or a month. But how are you looking at on a longer period of time to have that balance? And that can allow to have some recovery. So I know I'm going to work really hard for the next 5 years. And then maybe after that, I'm going to go travel around the world. Mm-hmm. So there's some of that. I think you have to have, when I was deep in the training for the Tahoe 200, there were some weeks where I was exercising 30 hours a week.
Mm.
And I knew that I was going to, in order for me to be able to make it, I had to rest at times. Mm-hmm. And I built that into my training plan. And so I would take an afternoon nap. And so I think it is important to understand both the physical part, but the mental part of how you recover, how you're taking care of your brain. Some people find meditation works really well. It doesn't work. It doesn't work as well for me. I haven't focused on it because I start meditating. My mind's always going on something. It works really well for my wife. But I know for me to get recovery, I will go out for a run or for a bike ride. Mm-hmm. And my wife is often the first one to tell me, because she can see if I'm starting to get a little bit annoying. Mm-hmm. And she will say, "Hey, yeah, hon, why don't you go for a bike ride or go out for a run?" And that's a euphemism for you're bugging the heck out of me. You need a break. So it is that it's how do we know those things that can slow our heart down a little bit or just get our mind into a better frame?
Yeah, I think that's always underestimated, the mental recovery that needs to go on. So
Yeah.
we live in such a wired world today that, quite frankly, it's a problem. We're so wired. Now I think people are understanding, hey, I got to unplug sometimes. Otherwise, I'll just be a hot wired mess here or something.
Yeah. It always amazes me where people will either go on vacation or they'll complain about their phone ringing and say, oh, my phone's ringing. And it's like, you actually have control of whether you pick up your phone. Turn your phone off. Put it, if you don't want to take emails or phone calls during work or when you're on vacation, then don't.
Mm-hmm.
Or say, and tell your staff that, hey, I am not going to be available for this time, or I'm only going to check emails once a day, because then you get that break. But we're not good at being able to feel like we can take the break. And I think sometimes ego gets in the way.
Sure.
Like, I am so good that they can't live without me for a week. And I used to think that I'm not that good. So,
the other thing I think is the fear of missing out. In today's world, everything's available 24/7. Oh, did I miss something? It probably won't matter. I think of the Ben Franklins, and the people of that day had rich conversations and relationships with people, and they sent letters back and forth that were carried by horses. So it was, it still worked just fine for them, but it wasn't the 24/7 like we experience.
No, and it wasn't. And I talk a lot about priorities and understanding what's important. I'm really good at getting up every morning and doing some sort of exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife is really good about that. I'm seeing our kids start to be better at it. And a lot of times people say, oh, I just don't have time to get to the gym or do exercise. And my response is, it's a matter of a priority. If the president of the United States can find time to exercise, then my guess is you can too.
Yeah.
But it is priorities. I'll take people through an exercise where I have them look at how much time are you sleeping? How much time are you at work? And then everything else, that's your time to play with.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at it, a lot of times it's 60 to 70 hours. Yep. Now, that includes eating, that because we have 168 hours in the week, and you can find some time to exercise if that's important to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's whether you're the Bill Gates or the poorest person in the world, you've got the same 24 hours every day.
You do. Yeah. And what I found with all these executives I talk to is they're very deliberate on what they say yes to, but they also know what to say no to.
Mm-hmm.
And that you have to be able to say no to certain things. One of the guys I was talking to, he's the chief human resources officer for a mid-sized technology company. He deeply involved in soccer as a very high level official, soccer referee, and he's also an Ironman. And I was asking, how do you balance the time out? And he goes, when I train for an Ironman, I know I need 12 hours in the week.
Mm-hmm.
That's 7% of my week. I can find 12 hours. When I trained for Tahoe, there were some weeks I needed 30 hours.
Mm-hmm. And
I got to find those 30 hours. This is important to me. And where am I going to find it? So
I think the other piece that comes in is we're not always that effective in, quote, our hours of work. I've always been intrigued with Cal Newport and his deep work thing. Is we may spend 8 hours at work, but we're probably only really effective for 3 to 4 of those hours. And the rest of it is just stuff. And we could do better.
One of the CEOs I worked for years, he would say, you can find 5% of your time to work on these specific projects. Is that he wanted us to do more innovative stuff. It's find 5% of your time and do it that way. And he goes, we are not that efficient where we can't find 5%. And it's true. And I would tell my staff, I would say, okay, I want you to spend 5% of your time on stuff that doesn't relate to your goals, that's going to maybe help us move the needle in the next 5-10 years. And I said, we're not that efficient where we can't find 5%.
Yeah. And quite frankly, sometimes some of the things we're doing don't need to be done, but we have to decide that.
Yeah.
So.
And it's hard, but it's those people that I talked to, they were really good at saying that doesn't need to be done. and somebody else can do that, or it just stop doing it.
I remember years ago reading an article about, I think it was the CEO of Motorola, and he had a list of, I think, 8 things on his desk, literally under the glass on the desk. And those were his priorities. He said, whenever somebody asked him to do anything, he'd look at the list and say, is it on there? If it's not on the list, I'm not going to that meeting. I'm not participating in this conversation, whatever it is.
It reminds me of a similar story, Lynn. One of the CEOs I talked to, he was meeting with his chief marketing officer, and they were talking about the goals for the quarter. And his chief marketing officer comes up and says, I got these 8 things that I'm going to do. And CEO turns to him and says, what are the 3 most important things that you're going to get done? He goes, I'm going to do all 8 of these. They went back and forth like, you can't do all 8. Great. So figure out the 3. He goes, no, I'm going to do all 8. And so finally the CEO looks at him. He says, I'm only going to pay you on 3. So what 3 do you want me to pay you on for your quarterly bonus? That's where I'm going to put the priority.
Yep. Yeah, I remember years ago, I was talking to our grade school principal that we had for our kids. And he said, I used to put a little to-do list on with 4 or 5 things on it. But he said, now I just put 2 things on it because as a principal, a lot of things just show up at your desk every day. So if I can accomplish 2 things, I'm really doing pretty good.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to what are you saying yes to, but also what are you saying no to? Too often it's exercise. Oh, I got to get that project done, so I'm not going to exercise today. And I think especially as we get older, that we need that to stay fresh. And there's a tremendous amount of research that shows that.
Yeah, that's probably been one of my failings. I keep my mind active, but my body certainly needs more movement to it. And there's so many ways to do that in today's world that I have no excuses.
Yeah, I think if we have we won't get into the healthcare problem we have here in the U.S. and globally, but I think if we moved more and we ate less, we would solve a big chunk of the problem. And I was talking to a relative of mine who's a physical therapist and runs a decent sized physical therapy organization. And at Christmas, I was asking him, I said, what is it that we could do more of to prevent people from coming in and seeing a physical therapist? And he goes, if people just moved more. It was that easy. Get out for a walk.
Yep. Yeah, it's and there's so many ways to move in today's world. There's almost no excuse for it. And whether you just stand up more with a standing desk, that was everybody thought that was novel. But yeah, most of the people in life spend a lot of their time standing, and before we all got cubicles.
And it's find out what you enjoy doing. I do not like going to the gym. If I signed up for a gym membership, it would be a waste of money. My wife is much better at it. I enjoy going out for a bike ride. I enjoy going out for a run in the country or just run along. And so I enjoy that. And if you enjoy it, there's a greater chance that you will do it. So find that thing that you really enjoy doing it. And then the other thing, I often talk about is find somebody that will do it with you.
Sure.
The hardest part of going to a gym or going to exercise is getting out your front door. And if you can get out the front door, you're like way ahead of so many other people. And one of the ways to do that is if there's somebody that you're meeting, you're going to go run with somebody. You and I were going to go run today, Lynn, and I knew you were going to be waiting for me.
Yep.
We're probably both lying in bed going, oh, I don't really want to go. It's raining out. But what I'm thinking is Lynn's going to be there. I can't let Lynn down. And you're probably thinking the same thing.
Absolutely.
So find that accountability partner.
Yeah. And I think there's also trigger things. I remember an executive I coached years ago, and she wanted to run more or get out. So what she did is she put her shoes on the toilet so that at the very least, every morning she had to move the shoes.
I mean, it's a great strategy because it's a reminder.
Yeah.
But the other thing along those lines is make it easier for you to get out. Right. There were many days where I had to be leaving the house at 4 a.m. in order to go for a 20-mile bike ride. And so the night before, I would lay out my shoes, my socks, what I was going to wear. I would have food laid out. I would have my water bottle set. And so I could, from the time I got out of bed till the time my legs were moving, could be 5 minutes.
Sure, absolutely.
So you got to make it easier to get rid of all those excuses. Because if there's a lot of excuses, you're going to be going, oh, I got to get some food. Where's the food? And then every time you're doing that, you're giving yourself one step closer to staying in bed.
Yep, absolutely. That you got to make that hurdle to get started as low as you possibly can. I can appreciate that. Whether it's exercise or almost anything in life, try to make that hurdle low.
Yeah. And part of the book, it's called Epic Performances. And the E, and I'll get to the I in a second, but the E is how do you envision the big things in life you want to do? The P is how do you put a plan in order to do them? The I is iterate. And I want to come back to this one to your point, and how you start off at one level and you work your way up. The C is how do you collaborate? Somebody's done this before. How do you learn from them? And then perform. How do you go out and do it? But that I is you don't set the highest hurdle. Kind of to your point, Lynn, you set a low bar, you get over it, and you have some successes. And so many of the people I talked to when I was talking to them about confidence, I said, where does your confidence comes from? And they say, our confidence comes from achieving smaller things and having smaller successes. When you can jump over the 1 foot hurdle, then you set a 2 foot hurdle, and then a 2.5 foot hurdle, and then a 3 foot hurdle. And you just kind of raise the bar a little bit each time.
Yeah, I think, again, I've seen some research and stuff on that. It's been true in my life that if I can see progress, that really helps. It's when I'm looking at the end goal all the time. But like you say, those first steps or those tiny habits or whatever it may be so that you're seeing some progress as you go along, make all the difference.
Yeah, I remember when I was 20, I cycled across the United States. And so it was 4,000 miles. And this was before GPS or cell phones or anything. And I had a AAA map, which I'm sure many of your listeners know what that is. Sometimes I'll speak on a podcast where it's a much younger group and they don't know what these maps are. And so it was a paper map. I folded it up. I carried it with me on my bike. And after my first day, I'd gone probably 60 or 70 miles. And I took a pen. This was a U.S. map. And I took a pen and I highlighted how far I'd gone. And I'd gone like a centimeter on the U.S. map.
Right.
And I'm so used to being able to look at the end goal, look at the big picture. And I was looking at the big picture. I was looking at the U.S. map, but I was also looking at the U.S. map where I'd gone a centimeter. And I had 39 more centimeters to go. And I thought, I can't look at that map. So I'm going to close it up until I've gone 1,000 miles. And then I'll pull it out at 1,000 miles. And then I'll draw the line in. And then I've gone 12 centimeters. Which is significant on the map. And so sometimes I think it's helpful to look at the big picture, but to your point, sometimes it's good. Just like you got to narrow in and look at those little wins. Don't look at such a big map.
So you mentioned your book and we've talked about it. Do you have an overall summary that you'd like to share about it? You gave me what EPIC stands for, but other thoughts on your book?
Yeah, no, thank you. I walked through what EPIC Performance stands for, and it's really how are you being more deliberate about where you want to go in life, at work, and how are you thinking bigger about what you want to accomplish? Often, and even when I work with goals and with companies and we're talking about their strategic goals, and a lot of them are thinking 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years out. And I think that's good. It's good to know what you're doing in the next 1 or 2 years. But what I like to do is let's think 20 years or 30 years out and then back into that. So we're more deliberate. And it's the same with life. So how are you thinking about those things that you want to accomplish in 20, 30 years so you can start working to them? Anything big isn't accomplished in a short amount of time.
No.
When I had gotten the idea that it's okay, I want the ability to retire. I knew I didn't want to probably wouldn't want to retire, but I wanted the ability to retire. I had that idea when I was 22. And I thought, what do I need to do? What are the skills I need to do? Because at the time I thought what I want to do is go into consulting, which is exactly what I've done. And I want to do it on a part-time basis. And so what are the financials I need to get under control? And that drove me. My first job out of college was working for an investment company. So it's like, okay, I get those skills. What are the other skills I'm going to need to be a consultant? So how are we more deliberate about how we're using this time on earth? Yeah. So that's a big thing. And how are we thinking bigger?
Yeah.
Too often we use kind of the excuse of, I can't do that. That's impossible. And where the idea for the book came, Lynn, is I I was doing a 300, kind of two things that kind of got it going. I was doing a 300-mile one-day bike ride. And I thought this would be the bike ride that would push me to my limit and break me in a sense, physically or mentally. And about 275 miles into it. And it was a rough day. I saw a dead body on the side of the road. I had collided with another bike and needed a new front wheel. But about 275 miles, it's 3 a.m. I'm only 25 miles away from the finish line. And I thought this would be what would break me. And it didn't come close. And maybe I was putting limits in my head that were a little unfair. I was holding back. Mm-hmm. And then, as I had mentioned, my wife and I took our kids out of school a couple of years ago, and we traveled for 1 year around the world. And we had some friends that held a going away party for us. And a couple people came up to me and they said, we could never do what you're doing. And I thought, you could. Not doing anything spectacular, not doing anything like that most people couldn't do. But we had been planning with it for 12 years. And even when we went through COVID, think of all the things that we did that at one point we would have said were impossible. For people working in the corporate world, and if you had gone to your CEO and said, hey, I think everybody ought to work from home, and I think we ought to start that this week, they would have said, you're nuts. And it's so many things like that we did that we at one point would have said is impossible. And so how do we turn that impossible into the possible? One of my favorite quotes is, once you stop believing something is impossible, you start believing it's possible.
Yep, absolutely.
So how do we shift that mindset a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned I was coaching a VP in finance area at the COVID. And in 2019, he was saying, yeah, we're going to start a little sample project of 10 people or so, see if they can work from home. And so then I talked to him in February of 2020. He says, yeah, everybody's home.
Yeah. Had I gone to our superintendent and said, hey, why don't we try this thing where all the teachers teach from home and all the students learn from home? Yeah, granted, it wasn't perfect at the beginning. It got better.
Yep.
And working from home got better. Now companies, their biggest challenge is, how do we get people back to the office?
Yeah.
And should we get people back to the office? I work in the Silicon Valley, and it's a big topic about I was down at Google the other day, and they talk about it. And one of the guys I was talking to, I said, do you notice a difference in terms of collaboration? And he said, yeah, there is a big difference. We're much more collaborative when we're working all in the same room. But CEOs are having a hard time figuring out how to manage that.
I think in today's world, too, with talent being an issue, people found out they could find remote talent, but now they can't get them to move to their local place of business. But they can let them go, but then they have to still find talent that's local. And it's a challenge.
It is. Yeah. As a former head of HR, I am glad I was not the head of HR during the pandemic. And I talked to a lot of my colleagues, and they said it was by far their most challenging time in their career.
Yeah, I think it has offered some opportunities. So one of my tagline is that with an Encore career, you can work when you want, where you want, and do the work you love. We can still contribute, even though we may not want to go into the office 50 hours a week, but there are roles that we can play. And so I'm encouraging people to learn how to do that so that you can still be you can really be very significant as far as helping others.
Yeah, and I love what you're doing, because you get to a certain point where you have a tremendous amount of knowledge. You don't want to be doing that 50 hours a week, but you also want to feel like you're contributing something back to society. And so how do we take advantage? And our culture is not good at using the kind of the more mature mind as well. In many ways, it's put to pasture. And so I like what you're doing of don't do that.
And one of the obvious things is that everybody's trying to bring in new talent from new areas, places that we haven't gotten talent from before. But these people come in that don't have the same context that maybe we did. Yeah. So all of a sudden, the senior talent can help mentor and coach and help the new talent develop, because we can say, oh, yeah, we saw that 20 years ago, and here's how it plays out. Or often, since a lot of issues in leadership and life are interpersonal, we can say, we've either done it wrong or here's how you handle some of these interpersonal issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a different perspective on it. It's funny because I was with a group of people that do stuff like I do and all similar ages. And we were talking about communication, and there were some people talking about, oh, we got to get people together. And I said, what would be good is to listen to some very successful people that are in the kind of the younger generation that are right out of school, because they're communicating just differently than we're used to.
Mm-hmm.
And how are they doing it? Because that's the future. Some of the stuff we're doing might be a little outdated.
One of the groups I work with is the Modern Elder Academy, but one of their big initiatives is how do we have intergenerational conversations? Because again, we can learn from each other, but in our society, we've dated ourselves generationally sometimes. And how do we pull that back together? Because certainly I learn a lot especially in the technology arena, from younger people, but they sometimes say, you've seen this problem before, Lynn. Could you tell us some insights?
That's good. It shows to your character that people feel comfortable saying that and say, hey, Lynn, we value your opinion. Will you share it? So That's great.
It's I think this Chip Conley that started the Modern Elder Academy, he talks about being a mentor. You're both an intern and a mentor. That's probably what I aspire to.
It sounds like you're doing a great job, Lynn.
Well, I will include your links and the stuff to the resources, your book, and those kinds of things. We'll share all that in the show notes. And Brian, I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been a great conversation, and thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you, Lynn. Pleasure being on your show.
Well, just a quick recap of the things we talked about. Brian talked about his book and those 100 interviews he did. He talked about the need for having a big why in your life. Then he mentioned, we had conversation around priorities and also the need to say no to things. He gave us his framework for being deliberate about achieving big things and the importance of your mindset. We'll have Brian's contact information in the show notes. So remember, with an Encore career, the rewards are great. You can be creating value in the world beyond winning that next pickleball game. You can work when you want, where you want, and you can do the work you love. And if you're ready to get started today, please contact me at lynn@lynnfrias.com or head over to my website, listen to a few podcasts, and get on the email list. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.